King Menander I was one of the most influential people in the history of the world for the development of Buddhism. Though many of the specifics of his life are not well known, his empire did more to spread Buddhism around the world than practically any other ruler save Ashoka. His greatest legacy is the Milindapanha, which documents his conversations with the monk Nagasena and is one of the most important texts in all of Buddhism. His empire began around the year 160 or 155 BC, and at its height was extremely large, unifying the territories left over by Alexander the Great. His territories extended from the remnants of the Greek Empire Bactria in the west, and included most of Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan. From here it stretched out across Asia to include the northwest part of India, and much of the area in between. His capital is believed to be Sagala, now known as Sialkot, in northern Pakistan. Raised Hindu, the empire that Menander inherited was a confusing mess of cultures and languages. Situated firmly in the Middle East, many of his citizens were leftovers from the days of the Greco-Bactrian rule. The prevalence of Greeks in the region is thought to be the result of Alexander the Great exiling criminals and other undesirables to the farthest reaches of his empire. These people colonized the land and were ultimately absorbed by Menander's empire as he became the first Indo-Bactrian king. As such, his empire is one of the most significant links between Greek and Indian cultures. These two vastly different cultures both had an enormous influence on the development of Buddhism, and it was King Menander who was able to unify them into a cohesive whole. Despite this, the end result was by no means a homogeneous people with one distinct set of values. The evidence of this is in the name of the king himself, because while the Greeks called him Menander, the Indians called him Milinda. Much of what is known about Menander, as well as the various phases that his empire went through, is a result of the coins that were produced by the government under his reign. Coins from the beginning of his rule read Menander the Savior, possibly indicating a desire to persuade wary citizens of the righteousness of his military might. However, later coins minted after his conversion replaced this phrase with Menander the Just. This is symbolic of the king's new devotion to harmony and equilibrium, thereby showing him to be a figure of justice and equality. This is as opposed to calling himself a savior, which implies that he is different or better than other people, which of course is an impossibility for a Buddhist. Furthermore, coins from the latter part of his reign bear numerous symbols indicating a connection to Buddhism. The phrase, "Great King, follower of the Dharma," appears on many of them alongside his face, and whereas previously there had been a depiction of Athena in a warlike pose, this was later replaced with an image of her without her shield, and making a peaceful Buddhist gesture, the Vitarka Mudra. In addition, an 8-spoked wheel, representing the noble Eightfold Path, appears on many coins, as does a seated lion alongside the phrase Pillars of Ashoka. The event which likely prompted his conversion to Buddhism is one of the most storied and legendary tales in the entire religion. It is said that the Buddhist monk Nagasena brought 8,000 followers, who encountered 500 Greek ministers alongside the king. Nagasena, addressing the king, asked him a series of questions, and was in turn asked many questions by the king himself. The record of their dialogue is preserved in the Milindapanha, literally meaning the questions of Milina, which was transcribed circa 100 BC, and has remained one of the most important texts in all of Theravada Buddhism. When Menander asked Nagasena to identify himself and announce who has come into his palace with 8,000 monks, Nagasena replies, "No one." This elucidates the principle of anatman, or the lack of identity of self. Nagasena immediately proves his wisdom by not identifying himself through his name, which is of course merely a temporary moniker of his earthly body, and has no greater significance unto itself. Menander replies that if there is no self, and if the man before him is not Nagasena, but is in fact no one, then who is it that observes the rites of Buddhism, that seeks the enlightenment and nirvana, that engages in a life of morality, and is ultimately reincarnated? If there is no self, then how do these things apply to earthly men? This produces the famous debate of the chariot, wherein Nagasena gradually asks Menander to identify whether or not a chariot remains the same after an individual piece is removed or replaced. The conclusion is that the concept of the self or individual, if it can be said to exist at all, lies in the interrelationship of all of its various components, and that one is not able to replace any single part and have that thing remain the same, nor does any single part represent the self in its totality. The conclusion is that Buddhism, in contrast to Cartesian dualism, believes that the mind and body are one, a single entity contributing to the individual and subjective concept of self, despite the fact that this concept has no greater objective truth in terms of the grand scale of the universe. Though the precise year remains a mystery, it is known that while he was still a very powerful king, he converted to Buddhism and abdicated his throne to his wife, Agathoclea. Famously profiled by Plutarch, the Greek biographer's account of his death actually seems to contradict the little bit that is known about him. Whereas Plutarch indicates that his death came while he was on a campaign to acquire more land, the gnildn indicates that after Menander abdicated his throne, he lived the rest of his life as a monk, and died uneventfully in service of the Buddha's teachings. However, there are numerous consistent accounts of the events which followed his death, in which the town and his kingdoms fought bitterly over their king's ashes, ultimately deciding to share them by dividing them up and allotting out a little bit to each town to honor the king as each saw fit. For the most part, his ashes were placed in monuments in a ritual that is similar to that used in the burial of the Buddha. The remnants of these shrines are possibly the stupas that dot his empire. Having been succeeded by his wife Agathoclea, she remained regent until their son Strato I came of age. Coins minted under her rule are a combination of the titles used by the late king. Both the Savior and Follower of the Dharma appear on her coins. Similarly, subsequent kings observed the tradition set forth by the late Menander in mintings of their own coins. Various rulers depict themselves alongside the Buddhist wheel, and others show themselves making the sign of the Vitarka Mudra. All in all, few men are able to accomplish as much in their pursuit of a career, nor find the spiritual fulfillment and satisfaction that caused him to resign it all towards the end of his days. Menander united a notoriously unstable region of the world, if only temporarily, and introduced it to the cleansing tranquility of Buddhism. Remnants of this day still lie among the ancient ruins, but unfortunately, little of the religious teachings they espouse has remained. Still, Menander's legacy will always be remembered by Theravadan Buddhists everywhere for his contribution of the gnildn, and for the example he set as the warrior king who was pacified by his belief in the virtuousness and sanctity of the Buddha.